Hello again, everyone. Linux Mint 19.3 was released about 2 weeks ago, and unfortunately, I've been under the weather, so I've been unable to actually record my review because I could barely talk at all. The cold was that bad, but now that I'm better, it's finally time to check out this new release. And I'm sure that everyone else has probably covered this by now, but I figured I would give you guys my thoughts on Linux Mint 19.3. So that's what I'm going to be reviewing in this video. I have installed on this Serval workstation laptop right here that was provided by System 76. And I figured it'd be an interesting test case to give Linux Mint 19.3 a try because this laptop is brand new. It's got a 9th generation Core i9 processor in here. And I was curious to see how well this distribution would perform on this machine. So let's go ahead and get to the review. So here it is. Here is Mint 19.3, the Cinnamon Edition, running on the System 76 Serval WS. Thanks again to System 76 for providing this laptop for a review. There will be a review of this hardware on my channel very soon, so subscribe if you haven't already done so. Now, I didn't record the installation process. I did record that during my beta review of 19.3, and it hasn't changed since then. In fact, the installer hasn't changed at all in years, so I didn't really feel like there was any reason to go over that yet again. But real quick about the installer, I'll mention a few things. First of all, it installed fast enough. It wasn't the fastest installer I've ever used, not the slowest. It hasn't changed in years. And to be honest, it doesn't really need to because it gets the job done. And at the end of the day, what more can we ask for? And although the installer is decent, it probably would be nice if they would refresh that in a future release to make that more modern. But I'm probably just nitpicking. The installer is just fine. So anyway, here it is. It's installed and we get this welcome screen just like we always do. And I've gone over this in previous videos. I'm just going to take a quick look through here. Nothing stands out as being incredibly new. I mean, we have our system snapshots like usual. We have driver manager, an update manager, basically all of the things that you would expect to see. It hasn't changed much in this release. We have links to documentation, links to forums and a chat room if you need assistance, and also a way to contribute. You can click this button to find out how you can give back to the project. And here we have the default desktop. So we have a new wallpaper this time around. It looks very dark, and depending on the color quality of your screen, you may or may not see what looks like little lines or gradients or something like that that you see in the background. On my TV that I use for monitoring my recording, I can't even make those lines out at all. But on the laptop screen, I can see them just fine. So it's kind of interesting that they would choose that, considering that you may or may not even be able to notice the background detail. Probably also depends on the brightness of your screen as well. But it's easy to change the wallpaper, and they do give you quite a few. So if you click Change Desktop Background, we get some default backgrounds. So we have several here, for example. I just changed it to this one, which is actually pretty interesting. And then we also have wallpapers from various releases right here that we can choose if the default doesn't suit our fancy. And actually this one is pretty cool, so maybe I'll just leave it on this. Now Linux Mint 19.3 hasn't changed a whole lot from previous releases. We probably can't expect it to because 19.3 is technically going to be the last release in the 19 series because they're going to be coming out with Linux Mint 20, most likely in April or May of 2020, if I had to guess. So basically right now, they're going to be preparing for that next big jump. This is more of a point release. They did manage to squeeze in Cinnamon 4.4, so that's what powers this release. They also have a Mate edition and an XFCE edition as well. And that might be useful if you're running this on an older machine. Cinnamon may take more horsepower than some environments, though it actually doesn't seem to run that bad at all. So if I bring up the monitor here, system monitor, we can see with only this open, in fact, I'll go ahead and close it, we don't really have much going on at idle at all. Only 1.1 gigabytes or so of the 32 gigs of RAM are in use. This has 16 cores, actually has 8 cores, but it shows up as 16 with hyperthreading. And we can see that none of the CPUs are really all that busy, so at idle it actually doesn't consume all that much, leaving the resources free for whatever application we want to be running. One thing I can tell you right away is that 19.3 performs very well. I'll just go ahead and open up some random applications here. And we can see that things are pretty much just lightning quick. And you can't ask for more than that. It multitasks very well. I don't see any lag when I'm moving things around. And depending on the application, I mean, some applications are more memory hungry than others. It basically performs really well, and I can't complain. I think it's very performant. Go ahead and close some of these things that I just randomly opened. But you get the idea. The performance is pretty good. Now, as far as new features are concerned, again, there's not a whole lot, but I'll cover a few things. There's actually a lot of smaller improvements, too many in number to go over in one video. But one of the things that is new in this release is you'll see this icon right here. That's actually for the system reports, and as it's saying right here, it says it has detected some kind of problem. So if I click on that, it's running some checks. Now basically, if there are what it considers a problem or anything like that with your installation, it's supposed to show you that in this screen or in this application right here. Now in my case, it's actually recommending that I install language packs. So if I click on that, let's see what it wants to do. Basically wants me to install some hyphenation packages, which I'm not going to do right now. I don't really feel like that would be a problem necessarily. I would think hardware compatibility would be more important, but you know, it does give you this information and you can click ignore problem if you don't want to be bothered by that particular item again. And it's also coming up with a message here. It's considering it a problem that I haven't configured time shift backups yet, which is basically a snapshot utility that's a really good idea to set up. But what's interesting about this is that since it doesn't set it up for you, then every default installation of Linux Mint, regardless of whether you actually have real problems or not, is always going to show an exclamation mark here at the bottom, which will lead you to believe that there might be a serious problem, just to find out it's recommending that you install or set up time shift. I kind of agree with that it's important and they should let you know. I'm not really sure if I feel like this is the best way to do it. I mean, if they keep on putting very generic things in here, then no one's going to take system reports seriously, and then people might just end up ignoring this. Another thing here, we have system information, which gives you a lot of information about your hardware. Again, this is the Serval workstation from System 76. If you're curious, you can see some of the information here on this machine. Basically shows you what kind of hardware you have. Then you also have a section for crash reports here as well. But overall, you know, this can be useful to let you guys know if you're having any actual problems with your machine, and hopefully it'll give you some feedback on how to correct any issues that it finds. Another new feature that I'll mention real quick is that high DPI support has been improved, but I haven't had a chance to test that yet. This laptop only has a 1080p display. I don't have a 4K laptop right now to test it on, but any improvements that they make to high DPI is definitely welcome, and I think that it's good that they have put some focus on that. Now, another thing that's interesting is if I click on the Linux Mint menu here, there's an app called Celluloid that basically takes over as the default video player for any video files that you might have on your hard drive. And it's basically taking over as the default from XPlayer, which has been the default video player for a while now. Now, Celluloid itself is based on the MPV backend. I actually use MPV and I like it quite a bit, so that's a good choice. But it's kind of unusual that Linux Mint is going away from their own XPlayer as default. I just wonder what that might mean for the future if they're going to be getting away from XApps, because I do feel that the XApps that they develop in-house just adds more fragmentation. And I don't mind there being more options. Options are generally a good thing to have. But when you have a small development team like the Linux Mint team, I have been basically a little nervous that they might be spread a little bit too thin by developing their own applications when we have already a large number of great applications for every default use case. And I almost wonder if this is a sign that maybe they'll be moving away from that, but it's too soon to tell right now. But it is fun to think ahead and see what the version 20 release might look like next year, or rather later this year by the time you're seeing this and by the time I have this edited. Another new app in this release is Gnote, which is installed by default on 19.3. And this actually replaces Tomboy as the default application for note-taking. So if this is something you use, I don't personally use note-taking apps, just know ahead of time that the default has changed. However, if you are upgrading from a previous release, I don't have any reason to think that Tomboy will be removed, but most likely Gnote will be added. Now previously we had GIMP installed by default, so if I go down here to Applications and then Graphics, normally you would find GIMP listed here by default, which is basically an alternative to Photoshop. Now normally GIMP would be on this list, but as you can see, it's not here by default. Obviously, if I had GIMP installed from a previous installation and then I upgraded, it should still be here. But instead, we have Drawing as the default application for drawing related things. And as you can see, it's a lot simpler to use than GIMP. And, I don't really get too carried away with the default photo app or anything like that because GIMP is really easy to install, so it's easy to get back if you need it. And this does look easier to use, so I guess this might be more approachable by non-graphics people. But if GIMP is something that you prefer, well, it's easy to install, like I said, because basically apps are easy to install. So what I'll do is open up the application installer, software manager right here. And then I can simply type GIMP in the search. And this will give you an opportunity to see what it looks like to install apps in this release. So I'll just go ahead and install it. Why not? So here it is, really easy to find. I'll click Install, Continue. And now that it's installed, which actually took quite a while for some reason, I'm not really sure why. You can click on Launch right here, but you should find it in the Applications menu pretty much right away, and there it is. And GIMP is opening, so we have a successful installation, but that's basically how you install packages. You just open up the software manager, search for what you want, and then go ahead and click Install. Couldn't be easier. Let's go ahead and clean up the screen a little bit here. And here we have Firefox, which, if you've ever used Firefox before, you know pretty much what to expect, regardless of what operating system you're using. For the most part, Firefox is Firefox. It's the default browser in Mint, as it has been for quite some time now. But there is one downside that kind of drives me a little crazy in regards to Mint's implementation of Firefox, and that's the default search. So for example, if I was to put a search term up here, I'll just search for Ubuntu, press enter, and you can see that unfortunately, Yahoo is the default search engine. Now, personal gripes against Yahoo aside, Linux Mint basically profits from Yahoo being the default search engine, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that because a distribution is very hard to maintain, and being able to make a little bit of money to, repay their server hosting costs or whatever other expenses they might have, I'm all for that because it's a good thing to have some kind of income to help pay for those kinds of expenses. And when it comes to search engines are easy to change, and that's true of anything basically. If you don't like the default, change it to something else. But what I don't like about this is the links that Linux Mint goes to try to prevent you from using Google. So if I go here to Preferences, and then Search, we can see that we have some options here for the default search engine. Now again, Yahoo is the default, but if we want to choose a different one, we can click here and choose one of the alternatives here. DuckDuckGo being my personal favorite, so I'm glad to see that here. But what's interesting is that Google is not present on this list, whereas it normally is present on any other installation of Firefox. Basically what they're doing is editing the default profile and removing Google from the list to basically make it so that it's a little harder to choose Google, which I don't agree with because I feel like a distribution should be a little bit unbiased here and not try to force their opinions on others or make people have to jump through hoops just to get something that you would normally get very easily somewhere else. And considering that it takes a little bit of effort on their part to remove this from the default profile, I really wish they wouldn't do that. So to re-add Google, what you do is you click here to find more search engines. And this actually takes you to a Linux Mint specific web page. And if you scroll down, it basically gives you some information on why they have basically made it this way. And if you look down here, you see a Google icon. So you can basically add these search engines by clicking on them. So I'll add Google. And then it says, how can I add Google to Linux Mint? Click here to add Google. So I'll do that. And then click add. And now Google is on the list of available search engines. Now again, I understand defaulting to Yahoo because it's always a good thing when a project can repay some of their expenses. But there's absolutely no excuse, in my opinion, to sour the user experience and force users to jump through hoops to do something they wouldn't have to jump through hoops for on any other platform. And this is something they've been doing for a while now, but I just kind of feel like it's time to stop and just not do that, especially considering I'm pretty sure that changing this actually violates Mozilla's branding policy. But, that's just one minor complaint. If you want Google, that's what you have to do to add it. You just have to jump through that extra hoop. Now, that's a relatively minor complaint in comparison to hardware support, which is actually a bigger problem that I've run into. Now, overall, I think that Linux Mint 19.3 is a very solid offering for the Linux desktop. It has a lot of features, a lot of customization. I think Linux users will love it. But when it comes to hardware support, it lags behind others a little bit because it's based on LTS, which is not really a problem because I prefer LTS, but you always have to give your users the most recent kernel with LTS. Otherwise, they may have some hardware support issues if they were to install a older Linux Mint. When I say older, we're at 19.3, so the third version of 19, and we're trying to install this on a more modern laptop or desktop, you might run into issues. Now specifically, what you'll notice is if I open a terminal, I do uname-r, you can see that I am actually running kernel 5.3. Linux Mint 19.3 actually comes with kernel 5.0. Now, it's kind of interesting how this worked out because I had a lot of trouble installing Linux Mint 19.3 on this Serval laptop. Now, the thing is, when you have an LTS or long-term supported base, after almost 2 years, the kernel kind of starts to show its signs of age. Now, Ubuntu LTS, which this is based on, actually gives you a way to keep the kernel on a more recent version so that you benefit from better hardware support. After all, most drivers are in the Linux kernel, so it's always important to give your users the most up-to-date kernel that you can without sacrificing stability. 5.3 is proven, it works really well. So what I did was I installed the System76 driver, which is actually what pulled in kernel 5.3. That's what I ended up on when I rebooted it. Now overall, the hardware support was pretty terrible on this one because I actually had trouble getting it installed. I had to actually disable UEFI boot. I'm not talking about secure boot. I had to actually disable UEFI completely just to get live mode to even start on this laptop. Reason being, this is a brand new laptop model and the base that Linux Mint is using is actually getting kind of old now. So those built-in drivers in kernel 5.0 just aren't really going to cut it. Now the LTS version of Ubuntu actually updates their hardware enablement stack regularly, so this isn't really a problem. Now Linux Mint is hesitant to give you a newer kernel because they're under the false impression that having a newer kernel means that you might have stability issues, and actually the opposite is true because hardware support suffers if you don't actually have a recent kernel. Now they make it pretty easy to install newer kernels, but the problem is if you can't get your laptop to boot in the first place, then you're not going to be able to use their utility in order to install a newer kernel. So in my case, like I said, I had to completely disable UEFI to even get Linux Mint 19.3 to start on this machine at all. So I'm really hoping in future releases they actually reverse that policy because again, if you're going to base your distribution on a long-term supported release, such as Ubuntu 18.04, it is your responsibility to offer your users the most up-to-date kernel and hardware support that you can. Otherwise, people will be in the situation that I'm in if they're trying a brand new laptop and installing something like Linux Mint, which is based on an older kernel. Now, overall, Linux Mint 19.3 is a very good release. I do have that complaint about hardware support, which I do feel is a really important one, but that's only going to impact about 10 to 20% of you guys. A lot of you will use 19.3 and probably not have any problems whatsoever. But again, if you're using it on a newer machine, maybe you'll run into that hardware support problem. And I just don't feel like in 2020 that should really be a problem anymore. But if you take that away and out of the equation, what you're left with is the fact that Linux Mint does give you a very solid desktop offering. You have a lot of customization available. You can change the themes. There's all kinds of cool things that you can do to make it your own. And if you're already running Linux Mint, for example, 19.2, there's really no reason not to upgrade to this release, because if it's already working with 19.2, then you're only going to benefit by updating to the latest version because you get new features, which is always great, and you also get Cinnamon 4.4, so you get the latest version of Cinnamon as well. So basically, I feel like if you are looking for a desktop Linux contender, Linux Mint 19.3 should be considered. Just be a little careful if you have a brand new machine with the newest chipset available. You may or may not run into hardware compatibility issues, but if you don't have a bleeding edge piece of hardware, you probably won't have any problems at all. So what are your opinions of Linux Mint 19.3? Let me know in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for checking out my video. I really appreciate it. If you found it useful, click that like button, and if you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe so you'll see the latest content as soon as it becomes available. If you want to help me out, there's links down below for my Patreon page, as well as links for purchasing my Linux books, and also my affiliate store, which has a listing of Linux-compatible hardware that I've actually tested personally. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.